It's really exciting to be here. I'm going to encourage Dean Wild and Ms. Berlin to, as you're planning next year's program, to remember that we do spend a third of our lives asleep, so I hope you spend a third of the program on something related to sleep in future years. So as Dean Wild mentioned, we are really experiencing an epidemic of sleep deficiency in our society. And she mentions how many people are suffering from sleep disorders and insufficient sleep. And it's really causing problems at all ages in our society. For example, children get, over the last century, each year they get about 1.5 minutes less sleep compared to the previous year. So that today they're getting about 2 hours less sleep in the United States per night than they did a century ago. Now, it's very unlikely that during that time period we have somehow evolved to need 2 hours less sleep per night for those kids. And so we're carrying around at all ages this burden of sleep deficiency. And it affects us in many, many ways. One of the things that I like to think about as a barometer of how sleep deprived we are as a society is just how many people are struggling to stay awake when they are driving. So every month, about 56 million Americans admit that they're having difficulty staying awake when they're driving. About 8 million of them lose that struggle and actually fall asleep at the wheel. And then that causes about 1 million crashes every year, 500,000 injuries every year, and about 55,000 of those are debilitating injuries that leave people either quadriplegic or seriously injured in some way. And it causes nearly 7,000 deaths every year. In fact, 1 out of every 5 car crashes is related to sleep deficiency in some way. And so, it really represents a very serious problem. Maybe if I stand over here, it'll be less problematic. So the question is, why is it that we even need to sleep? And sleep fulfills many different functions in the brain and in the body. It fulfills basic biological needs in the brain in particular. The brain uses more energy than any other part of the body. It's only 2 to 3% of the weight of the body, and yet it uses 20 to 30% of all the energy that we use. Professor Stickgold is going to be talking about the importance of sleep on our ability to remember things, on memory consolidation. Sleep is also critical for us to be able to maintain our focus and attention and alertness, so that if kids don't get enough sleep before they come to school during the daytime, then they're not going to be able to focus and pay attention in class. One of the reasons why there are so many drowsy driving crashes is that our ability to sustain our attention at a task like a routine, highly overlearned task like driving is going to be greatly impaired if we have not gotten the sleep that we need beforehand. So our reaction time, instead of being 1/4 of a second, for example, will be 3, 4, 5, or 6 seconds, and the average reaction time will be 3 times longer than it is if we are alert. And so that can have real consequences. It can have consequences at all different ends of the spectrum. Athletes, even top professional athletes, their reaction time will be more sluggish, and they will get fewer. The basketball teams will get fewer players, will get fewer free throws in. The tennis players will get fewer serves in, and the runners will not be as fast when they haven't gotten enough sleep. And also, as Professor Stickgold will talk about, the different stages of sleep are associated with the ability to integrate what we have learned with what we knew before, and provides a critical function for that. But one of the other functions of sleep is, as I mentioned, there's this furnace using all of this energy in the brain, and it is during sleep that we replenish the energy that we have used up during the daytime. And one of the sensors that tells us that the brain needs more sleep is actually located on cells in the brain, and it represents, as we begin to use up the energy, then and use up these energy stores, then some of the residual parts of the energy-related molecules build up in the brain, and we start becoming tired. And the brain starts being capable of making an involuntary transition from wakefulness to sleep. And of course, if that happens when you're driving, that can be very dangerous if you're struggling to stay awake and you lose that struggle. And the late Professor Bob McCarley was the one who discovered that it is adenosine levels building up in the brain that actually make us sleepy. And then ironically, what many of us do in order to sort of prevent that signal from getting through is we take caffeine in one form or another. And caffeine is a blocker of that receptor for adenosine. So it doesn't actually fulfill any of the biological need for sleep, but it blocks the receptor so that we are less likely to make that transition involuntarily. But it doesn't prevent it altogether. So think about that when you're sort of waking up and saying, oh, I can't function unless I have a cup of coffee. You know, you would function better if you actually got the sleep that you need, rather than papering over that situation with something that blocks the receptors. It would be like taking, you know, you instead of having your furnace come on when it's too cold in the house, you just put chewing gum in the thermostat so that you don't hear the fact, so that the signal is not transmitted that it's getting cold in the room. And of course, if that's the solution, then that can lead to burst pipes and all sorts of other problems. And in the same way, in the brain, if we don't get the sleep that we need, then we can't fulfill some of the key biological functions of sleep. And you can see the changes in this diagram. You remember that for a while that this is your brain on drugs. It was advertised on TV all the time. Well, this is your brain without a night of sleep. And you can see very specific changes. So this is energy utilization, and you can see in the area of the brain that's responsible for judgment, you can see that it is low on fuel, and so it is getting stone cold there, and that's one of the reasons why people who are not getting the sleep that they need are often exhibiting poor judgment in the decisions that they make. There's also, this is the area of the brain that relays sensory information from our vision, touch, and other senses to other areas of the brain. And this is the area that receives visual information. And we miss 10 times as many signals in our visual field. And that's one of the reasons why we have accidents when we're driving, because we don't even see the things that are happening. So we are much more likely to miss things that are happening. That's why it's so dangerous to have, let's say, an air traffic controller who is responsible for seeing the planes on the visual field from a monitor, because they're not going to be able to pick them up as readily. And so this is one of the... Now, another really key function of sleep that has just only recently been discovered has been the clearing of toxins from the brain. So this high energy utilizing organ, like any other, anything else that uses a lot of energy, there are some byproducts, metabolic byproducts of energy that are essentially debris in the brain. It's kind of like in your car, you begin to build up sludge in the oil, and you need to change the oil and get the sludge out. Well, in the brain, we build up toxic metabolites like amyloid beta and tau protein. And if we don't clear those out, they can be toxic to neurons in the brain. And that's one of the things that's associated with, for example, Alzheimer's disease, is amyloid beta plaques. And it is during sleep that these newly discovered glymphatic channels actually expand and flush out these toxins when we are asleep. And that turns out to be a critical function of sleep, and once this was discovered in 2012, it began to make people realize why there was an association with both sleep disorders and with people with insufficient sleep with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and other degenerative brain diseases. So one of the key functions of sleep is to help you maintain a healthy brain where these toxins are cleared out. Another key function of sleep is, and this has only been recognized in the last 20 years, that sleep is not only important for the brain, but is also critically important for the body. And so the cardiovascular system depends on sleep. It is during sleep that the heart is able to recover with a lower blood pressure and lower heart rate that happens during sleep, and repair can take place during that time. And people who don't get, whose sleep is either interrupted or who get an insufficient amount of sleep, they will begin to have higher blood pressure. And sleep disorders, like sleep-disordered breathing, sleep apnea, is the leading known cause of high blood pressure. And so anybody who is diagnosed with high blood pressure should have an evaluation to find out if they have sleep-disordered breathing, for example. But even adolescents, even teenagers, if their sleep is disturbed or fragmented or insufficient, they will have higher blood pressure than their peers, so they are on the road then to hypertension. And sleep also turns out to be critically important for our resilience and our resistance to infections. So the immune system is affected by the sleep that we get. So in the fall, this past fall, we were advised to get a flu shot. And when people get the flu shot, if they haven't had an adequate amount of sleep in the week before getting the flu shot, they have only half the antibody response than they have if they are sufficiently well rested. Similarly, during the winter, if you're exposed to the rhinovirus that causes the common cold, you'll have a 200 to 300% increased risk of actually catching a cold if you're getting an insufficient amount of sleep or if your sleep is fragmented and disturbed. So consolidation of sleep, getting a sufficient amount of sleep, are both important for your immune system to function effectively. And that may be why, that may be one of the reasons why sleep fragmentation is associated with an increased risk of cancer and an increased rate of growth of cancer tumors, because the immune system is being recognized as playing a more and more important role as we begin to understand it in the prevention of cancer. Now, sleep is also critical for regulation of appetite. People often talk about the freshman 15, which is sort of the gain in weight that occurs oftentimes when kids start college. And that gain in weight may be associated with the increased or the decreased amount of sleep that kids get when they go to college. You see, somewhere during evolution, sleep and appetite got kind of linked, and maybe that's because it's not fully understood why that's the case, but the most other animals don't sleep deprive themselves spontaneously unless they're starving. And so, the big cats, if they're not getting enough food, they will stay up for 24, 48, even 72 hours on a hunt. And during the time when they sleep deprive themselves in order to avoid starving, their brain goes into starvation mode and releases more hormones that make you feel hungry and less of the hormones that make us feel satisfied with what we have eaten. The problem is that we voluntarily sleep deprive ourselves when we're not starving at all. In fact, many times we have the refrigerator right there. And so we're sleep depriving ourselves, watching TV, watching a game, doing this, working, the night shift or whatever we're doing voluntarily. And then we have a food source right there. So when we are having these hormones being released that make us more hungry and less satisfied with what we have eaten, then we are more likely to overeat when we are sleep deprived. And then people gain weight. And then one of the other amazing things that happens when people are sleep deprived is that in terms of metabolism, the effectiveness of insulin is reduced. And glucose levels go up to a higher amount in response to the same meal. So now you have a situation where people are gaining weight and the response of the metabolic system to food is impaired. And this puts many people on and may be contributing to the epidemic of both obesity and diabetes because of these metabolic changes. And because this increase in obesity and diabetes that have happened over the last 20 to 40 years have paralleled the decrease in sleep duration in our population and the increased problem with the epidemic of sleep deficiency in our society. And amazingly enough, even fat cells need to sleep. So that if you biopsy fat cells in people who are well rested and biopsy fat cells from those same people when they have been chronically sleep deprived, the ability of those cells to respond and metabolize glucose is actually impaired from the individuals if they've been taken from individuals who are chronically sleep deprived. So the whole body is affected when we don't get enough sleep. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to argue that it's important to make sleep a priority. But it's not just the brain and the body, but even our emotions. We become much more volatile when we haven't gotten enough sleep. The risk of depression increases. The risk of suicidal ideation, anxiety disorders increase. Our ability to avoid flying off the handle when we are faced with an emotionally challenging situation becomes impaired because, and this has been studied here at the Harvard Medical School by looking at brain scans. The amygdala is a region of the brain that is responsible for emotional responsiveness. And so people in a scanner have been shown disturbing images, and the reaction, the response of the amygdala is 10 times greater in individuals who've missed a night of sleep as compared to those same individuals who are more calm in their response to these disturbing images if they have gotten a sufficient night of sleep beforehand. So it sets up sort of a perfect storm for situations in which we would not really want to place our children. And so you can imagine my surprise when I was bringing our daughter's now 24 years old, but when she was going to pre-K, a couple of decades ago, as nervous parents, my wife and I went to the pre-K school, and we sat down. They have you sit down in these little tiny chairs. And for me, that's a little bit of a challenge. So I'm sitting on these little chairs, and the teacher, we all want to know, how do we get our kids ready to go to preschool? And so she said, the most important thing that you can do to get your child prepared for school is make sure that they get a sufficient amount of sleep before they get here. And I'm looking around to see, did I have something, because does she realize that my whole life is spent on sleep? And I went up to her, and she said, I can tell within the first 10 minutes after the children arrive here if you've been dragging them around in the mall and kept them up too late. And she said, I'm just going to call you on your cell phone and have you pick them up because I'm not going to deal with them if you have not let them have a sufficient opportunity for sleep. So I went up to her afterwards and I said, have you been reading articles? Where did you find this information? She said, no, I've been teaching for more than a decade and I know what it's like to deal with children who are perfectly well behaved if they've gotten a sufficient amount of sleep, but are complete basket cases if their parents have kept them up before coming in. Maybe they were on a flight, maybe they were this, whatever. So, to this day, I'm stunned when I go to the malls or to a Walmart or to this or that at 10 or 11 o'clock at night and see in these 24-hour stores people, dragging around their kids, their young children. I made the mistake of commenting to one of the parents at one point. Don't do that. But in any case, I was always struck by the kindergarten teacher and what she said. And the parents of very young children, will often say, Johnny or Susie is they're not themselves today. They're crying. They're fussy. Because they didn't sleep last night. So parents realize that for very young children. The teachers realize it for the 5, 6, and 7-year-old. But then somehow we think that children grow out of it and they don't need to sleep. But that's just not true. The behavioral manifestations are more subtle, but they are just as serious. So we have a situation today in which 1 out of 5 boys in high school is diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, the symptoms of ADHD, the symptoms of sleep deficiency, can masquerade perfectly the symptoms of ADHD. So difficulty focusing attention. We already see that that's one of the consequences of sleep deficiency. Emotional lability. That's another one of the consequences of sleep deficiency. Difficulty keeping your anger and your under control. Another symptom of sleep deficiency. So yes, there are children with ADHD who need to be treated. But there are many, many more children who don't actually have ADHD, but they're misdiagnosed for ADHD because they're not getting a sufficient amount of sleep. And because it can't be that 1 out of 5 high school boys has this relatively uncommon condition. Now, as I mentioned, there are many, many different consequences of sleep deficiency, and I've just put a few of them on this slide. I've talked about the vaccination response, our distractibility, the increased risk of depression and suicidal ideation. Parents who don't set a 10 p.m. bedtime for their kids in high school, their children are at significantly greater risk of depression and suicidal ideation. Now, one thing that sometimes motivates kids, I was driving home a babysitter, and he was about 14 or 15 years old. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I do research on sleep." And he said, "What a waste of time. I try to get as little sleep as I can." And I said, "Okay." I said, "It's during sleep that you release the hormones that turn you from a boy to a man." And the next week, his mother called me and said, "What did you tell my son?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, he's become a sleep czar. He's like, 'Mom, turn off the radio. I have to go to sleep. You're disturbing my sleep,' and so on." And sometimes when I tell the professional athletes, I say, if you sleep 4 hours a night for a week, you decrease your levels of testosterone by an amount that's equivalent to 11 years of aging. And they're like, "Whoa, maybe I should pay more attention to this." So let's talk a little bit about sleep disorders. So, and one of the most common ones is insomnia. Another very common one is obstructive sleep apnea. It affects about 1 out of 3 men and about 1 out of 6 women. So it's a very common condition, which snoring is one of the most common symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea. And it increases the risk of cardiovascular death by an astounding 420%. And I'm just going to show you a slide that depicts survival. So this graph starts on the left when the participants in the study were about age 48 on average. And it follows the percent who are surviving. And the ones in white are the ones without sleep apnea, and the ones in red have sleep apnea. And we're going to follow them for 18 years when they would have been 66 years old. And you can see that at the beginning, there's not a very big difference between them. I mean, there's only about a double the risk of death. But then you see that the risk of the percent surviving is dramatically lower in those with sleep apnea. So by the time they would have been 66, only 58% of them are still alive, as compared to 94% of those without sleep apnea. And sadly, those who survive in the untreated sleep apnea group here, they get cognitive impairment about 10 years earlier and Alzheimer's disease about 5 years earlier than those without sleep apnea. So it's a real serious condition, and if you think that you might be at risk of it, you should really go to your doctor and have it evaluated. Now, let's see. There we go. Yeah. Well, Benjamin Franklin did say there'll be sleeping enough in your grave. And all I can say is you'll get there a lot sooner if you don't get enough sleep. So what are the things that steal our sleep? Well, one of them, it's a relatively new invention, is this electronic device, the iPad, or some sort of tablet. And it has 2 problems. Not only does it distract us and keep us from wanting to go to bed because we're engaged, it also bathes us in blue-enriched light that makes us more alert. And it also suppresses the release of the hormone melatonin that helps us to go to sleep at night. And it shifts our circadian rhythms to a later hour, making it more difficult for us to wake up in the morning, and we're more tired in the morning. Other than that, it's no problem to read from the iPad before going to sleep. Caffeine has a 6 to 9 hour half-life, and it does keep people awake. And so, because it's a wake-promoting people use it to stay awake, but they don't necessarily realize that it lasts so long. So I always cringe when I see people ordering, a double espresso after dinner. And they say, oh, it doesn't affect me. And it's true that there are inter-individual differences, and about 1 out of 4 people are particularly sensitive to the side effects of caffeine as compared to the others. But it does disturb the sleep of everybody. And of course, the television in the room and all the electronics, they should be out of the bedroom. You need to recharge, they need to recharge. So maybe it's better to have them recharge in another room. It's just something to think about. But of course, the goal is to be able to get sound sleep. And to be able to get sound sleep and get a sufficient amount of sleep, we need to make sleep a priority. And so there are things that you can do. You know when to wake up, and that's when you set your alarm for waking up. But one thing that can be very effective is setting a bedtime alarm. Figure out if you need about 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Then if you set an alarm, let's say 8 hours, because you don't sleep every moment that you're in bed, so 8.25 hours before you need to wake up, that will help you, remind you that it's time to go to bed. But there are several features that are critical for sleep. One is duration. Most adults need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep per night. It's critical that we get it at a consistent time. Disrupting the timing of your sleep can have just as adverse effect as getting an insufficient amount of sleep. So consistency in the timing of when you sleep and wake is really, really important. And then finally, the quality of sleep. If you have a sleep disorder, like sleep apnea, that is making it impossible for you to breathe and sleep, for example, at the same time, then you're not going to have good quality sleep, and that will interfere in your ability to function as well. If we do get the sleep that we need, then we're going to be more alert. We're going to perform better. Our athletic performance, our cognitive performance will be improved. And we will also, just as a side note, we're actually more attractive to other people. There's a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in which they took portrait photographs of individuals when they had gotten a sufficient amount of sleep, and then when they had stayed up all night. They showered, they were all cleaned up for each of the 2 portraits, and people could tell within 4 seconds they were more attracted to the same person who was and these were 700 images. They've done a very systematic study, but they found the people who had slept to be more attractive. They wanted to spend more time with them, etc., than the people who were sleep deprived. So there are many pluses to getting the sleep that you need, and I thank you for your attention tonight. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Stickgold, who's going to be sharing with you his enormous body of work about sleep and memory. So thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, and thanks to the program for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be talking about sleep. Yep, get it or forget it. I'm going to be talking about why we have to sleep and what we get from it. Now, I saw the hands go up with how many of you aren't getting enough sleep. So I think I'll repeat some of the things that Chuck said, because you know how that helps, right? So do we have to sleep? Well, here's what we know. We know that rats die without sleep. If you sleep deprive a rat for 2 weeks, it will invariably die. So rats need it. The same is true for humans. Now, Harvard Medical won't let us do that particular experiment. But there's a genetic condition known as fatal familial insomnia, which says it all. It's a prion disease. Harvard's gotten in my way here, so I can't. Can you people see the bottom of the? Some can and some can't. So there's one amino acid here. Oop, that's the wrong button. Back. There's one amino acid that's mutated in this protein. It's a prion disease, sort of like mad cow disease, except what it does is it causes people in midlife, in their 40s and 50s, to slowly lose the ability to sleep at all. And within 1 to 4 months after they stop sleeping, they all die. So humans need to sleep too. And maybe the most impressive data comes from studies of sea mammals, cetaceans, who can't afford to sleep because if they fell asleep, they would sink and drown. And so evolution, rather than simply eliminating sleep, which would have been relatively easy as a genetic fix, instead taught these animals to sleep on one half of their brain at a time. So they'll be sleeping with just their right brain, and then they'll sleep with just their left brain. And in that way manage to keep swimming even if it's just around in circles, and keep themselves alive. So they need to sleep, and you do too. Now, I'm going to talk today about several reasons that you need to sleep. Main one will be around memory and learning, but I'm also going to review some of the things Chuck said in terms of immune function, in terms of hormone regulation, and that clearing of toxins from the brain. Mood regulation, Chuck mentioned also, and learning and memory. So let's go through them one at a time, and let's see if I can convince you. If you take a bunch of individuals and give them a vaccination for hepatitis, and then look at the production of antibodies over time, it turns out that the body doesn't really start manufacturing the antibodies until after a couple of weeks. And for that time, those subjects who were slept normally and those who were sleep deprived for one night after receiving their immunization shot look pretty similar. But over the next 2 weeks, you see this effect. So that by 28 days, people who were sleep deprived for one night after receiving an immunization will have only half as much of an antibody production against the hepatitis, making you much, much more likely to not have sufficient immunization to protect you. Chuck mentioned the effects on insulin regulation. This is a study with subjects, college students, being restricted to 4 hours of sleep a night, not total deprivation, but 4 hours of sleep a night for 5 days. And after that, the rate at which their bodies could clear glucose out of their blood was reduced by 40%. The acute response to insulin was down by 30%, and they looked pre-diabetic. So just 5 days of half the normal amount of sleep is enough to make you look like you're getting type 2 diabetes. And Chuck talked about that clearance of metabolites from the brain. Beta amyloid is one of the 2 proteins that accumulates outside of the cells in your brain that is tightly linked to the development of Alzheimer's disease. And when you are asleep, you're clearing it out of your brain twice as fast as when you're awake. And even a single night of sleep deprivation leads to a measurable increase in the burden of beta amyloid in the brain. So I want to talk mostly about sleep-dependent memory evolution. I call it memory evolution because we used to talk about memory consolidation, this idea that you form a memory and a few hours later it's sort of cemented into your brain and then it's there forever. But if you have a spouse of any gender, you're aware of this phenomenon that as time goes on, your memories of events separate. Usually it's your spouse's memory who gets worse, right? But that sort of constant changing of our memories over years and years is what I refer to as memory evolution. And it's not just whether you remember it or not, but the details of how you remember it. So here's an example. Actually, this is something that Chuck referred to also, about the impact of sleep on just your ability to remember, in this case, just words. Here's the protocol. Subjects either are sleep deprived for a night. Too many buttons, not enough time. Are either sleep deprived for a night or get a normal night of sleep before coming into the lab to be exposed to a couple of hundred words on the screen. They're neutral, negative, and positive words. They're just asked to indicate, is this a positive word or a negative or neutral word? And then unbeknownst to them, when they come back a couple of days later, they receive a surprise test. It was not unbeknownst to them. Here, it was only unbeknownst to them there. So they give them the test, and it's a simple recognition test. They show them all 200 words that they had seen before, plus another 200, and ask them, which have you seen before and which haven't you? And here's what we see. In the group that slept well the night before they encoded it, memory recognition is quite high, both for the positive words and the negative words. It's reduced substantially for neutral words, but that's something we know a lot about our lives, that we remember the emotional parts. But when we test them 2 days later, when we test the ones who were sleep deprived, and again, they're being tested after 2 full nights of recovery sleep, so they're not tired anymore. When we test them for their memory for the positive words is reduced about in half. Their memory for the negative words is reduced about in half. But their memory for the negative words is mostly maintained. Meaning that if you were sleep deprived when you saw these words, you are twice as likely to remember the negative words as the positive or neutral ones. So when I'm in the psychiatry department, if someone comes into the psychiatrist and says, my wife says I have to come and see a psychiatrist, she says I'm depressed because I only remember the bad things that happen. Truly, he may be depressed, but he might also just be sleep deprived. That's enough to give you the sense that only the negative things are remembered. That's bad on the individual level. It can be catastrophic on the national level. I have this suspicion that the entire cause of the first Gulf War, seriously now, was this effect. Because you had decision makers who were highly sleep deprived trying to decide whether we should attack or not. And they're remembering, we've got these satellite photographs of these trucks that might be biological warfare, weapon development trucks. We've got to do something about it. And they forget they were also told that they looked like falafel trucks too. And that's kind of funny, but that's where our mind goes when we're sleep restricted, when we're sleep deprived. And the decisions could be made on that basis of an over remembering, and over dependence on negative memories. Now that's what happens when you're sleep restricted or sleep deprived before you learn something. What my work is really focused on, and what's really quite surprising to me when I found it, and to most other people, is that the sleep you get after you learn something is probably more important than the sleep you get before. I am the only lecturer whose lecture you will ever attend who will take it as a compliment if you fall asleep while I'm talking. Because I know you're just trying to enhance your memory of that event. Now, how big of an effect does that have? Here's one example. I'm going to take you through 3 examples altogether. But this is just a very simple test. What you're doing here is you're trying to learn to spot these diagonal bars in the lower left quadrant of your visual field when we flash pictures like this on the screen very quickly. And what we do when we train you on it is we see how fast we can flash that up there, and you still have 80% accuracy in detecting whether those bars are above each other like they are there or next to each other. And then we bring you back 12 hours later and give you the exact same test, and again, see how fast we can go before you can't do it. What do we find? Well, I'm saying we bring you back. I'm assuming you're all undergraduates, yes, because that's who we did the study with. What we find is that if we retest these subjects after 3, 6, or 9, or 12 hours, there's no improvement in how fast they can do the task if they're awake during this time. But if we let them sleep between training and testing, they're about 15 to 20% faster. Doesn't matter how long the time interval is, it only matters whether they slept or not. And in fact, we can wait even longer to test them. These are groups of subjects who were tested. I showed you the 0 and 1 day data, but these are other groups tested after 2, 3, 4, or 7 days. And they continue to get better without any practice. So it's not practice that makes perfect. It's practice plus sleep that makes perfect. And the terrifying finding is that if you sleep-deprived subjects for the first night after you train them, subsequent sleep is of no value whatsoever. So that after 2 full nights of recovery sleep, their performance here is not significantly different from baseline. So you have to get sleep, and you have to get it tonight. There's this concept of sleep bulimia, which is a binge purge concept. College students love it. They binge sleep on the weekends, and then they purge, getting 4 or 5 hours a night during the week. And they tell us that they're fine. They make it up on the weekend. Well, they might make it up in terms of getting back to full alertness, but it's really too late to remember what they didn't remember because they didn't sleep that first night. Now, sleep does much more complicated things than simply make us faster or stronger in our memories. It can do things like enhance verbal memory in some unexpected ways. So we did a study, and Jessica Payne was the lead on this. I'm sorry, a lot of my slides will have my coworkers and students listed. I should be clear that whenever I say we did something, I mean they did something, right? So with that admission, let me go forward. What the subjects in this study did is they heard on a tape 8 lists of words, and we're told, try to remember the words. We're going to test you on them later. And then either 20 minutes later or 12 hours later, we would test them. I'm going to give you a sense of what that's like. I'm going to show you one list. Now, they heard it on an audio tape. I'm going to show you the list. And I'm going to give you the same instructions as I gave them. Try to remember these words. You're going to be tested on it. Okay, so in the actual study, there were 8 lists, not 1. It was auditory, not visual. And we actually just gave them a blank sheet of paper at retest and had them write down what they remembered. That would be cumbersome here. So I'm going to show you words and ask you to raise your hands if you remember seeing them, okay? Now, for those of you who aren't MDs, you might not know that there are extensor muscles in this part of the arm. This is not raising your hand. This is not raising your hand. I want everybody around you to see how smart you are, okay? So for each of these words, if you remember seeing it, raise your hand. Oh, good. It's always embarrassing when we get hit. Okay. Good. Excellent. Good. What can I say? Well, if you looked around, you know you weren't alone. In fact, all 8 lists were generated the same way. We gave words like sleep to a couple of hundred psych students in introductory psych in college and said, write down the first 10 words that come to your mind when you think of sleep. And then we took the 10 or 12 that they wrote down most commonly, and for each of the lists, we would show the subjects in our study those words, but not the word that it was based on. And what we see is that classically 60 to 80, it looked like more like 90% of the subjects here, will mistakenly respond that they remember seeing the word. And that's because our brain is always extracting gist. It's when you go home and tell your family and you call your friends to talk about my great talk, you'll say, he showed us all the words related to sleep. And it doesn't matter what the words were, right? It's just the gist that's important. And our brain is very good at identifying those gists and holding on to them. So the question that Jess Payne asked was the following: what happens to that memory over time? So we had 4 groups of subjects. Some were trained in the morning, 2 groups in the morning, and 2 trained in the evening. In each condition, one group was tested after just 20 minutes to give us a sense of how well they formed these memories. And the other group was tested after 12 hours. And we can look at the difference to see how much are they forgetting across 12 hours, okay? Now, the ones who were trained in the morning and tested that evening were awake for the 12 hours. We told them no naps. Whereas those trained in the evening, tested the next morning, got a full night of sleep in between. And what do we see? Well, first of all, for those in the wake group, across the day, they forget about 40 to 45% of the words that the 20-minute group could remember. And even after sleep, they're forgetting about 25% of those words. That's of the words that they actually saw. But when you look at the words that weren't shown, those gist words that the brain came up with, they're still forgetting about 20% of them across a day awake. But across the night, the brain holds on to them tenaciously. It's holding on to the memory of what it thinks is most important. So that when you wake up in the morning, you have a memory that might be less accurate, but more useful in understanding what had happened. Now, you could imagine this happening for evolutionary reasons. In the previous, nope, wrong talk, sorry. So there are even, yeah, I need more sleep, it's true. There are even more sophisticated and impressive things that the brain does with our memories while we're asleep. And here's an example. In this study, subjects were shown 1, 2, or 3 of these cards on each of 200 trials and asked to predict whether it was going to be sunny or rainy in this simulated world, which might not seem obvious to you, but fortunately on these 200 trials we gave them feedback. So for example, on the first trial they might see this card and it turns out to be sunny, and if they're undergraduates they say, whatever. And then in the second trial they might see these 2 cards together and it turns out to be rainy. And one of the fun things about the human brain is that it's always making models and coming up with hypotheses and trying to understand. So most of you at this point have probably sort of said to yourself, okay, that one means sunny and these 2 mean rainy, and I don't remember what the 4th one was, but that one probably means sunny too. So we build these models, and then across 200 trials we test them. And so indeed, along comes the 3rd trial, and they say, okay, I've got this one, and it turns out to be rainy. And now they're totally confused, right? In fact, they think, I must not have remembered correctly what happened here. But the gimmick in this study is that each of the cards has a certain probability of being associated with sun or rain. So 80% of the times you see the triangles, it's going to turn out to be rainy, but only 20% of the time you see the squares will be rainy. And although no one can quite grasp this all, they get a good model of it. It's a kind of learning that we call probabilistic learning, and humans are horrible at it. But they get the gist, okay? So that after these 200 trials, always with the feedback of the correct answer, we give them 100 trials with no feedback and ask whether they're guessing the optimal choice. And they get 70, 80 of them out of 100 correct. They're doing really well. Nobody's getting 100. Nobody really understands the rules fully, but they're pretty good at it. Then we send them away for 12 hours and do the exact same test. Same 100 stimuli. And in the subjects who were trained in the morning and tested that evening without sleep, they get a couple of extra cards correct, but not significantly more than they were at baseline. It's impressive that they remember what they learned, but they certainly aren't getting better. After a night of sleep, they're 10% better. they're doing better on this task after a night of sleep than they were right after they learned it. In a very real sense, these subjects, when they wake up in the morning, have a better understanding of how the world works than they had when they went to bed the night before. And that's what sleep is giving them. So you do need to sleep, or rather, you need to sleep. You need to sleep to maintain alertness and optimal cognitive functioning, to optimize your immune defenses, to maintain hormonal regulation and weight, to prevent beta amyloid buildup and Alzheimer's, to permit sleep-dependent learning and memory consolidation, and as Chuck pointed out, just to be happy. Or, to put it another way, if you don't get enough sleep, you'll end up stupid, fat, sick, and unhappy. The choice is yours. Thank you.